Good morning, everyone. It's morning here in Dunedin, New Zealand. Good afternoon to those of you in North America. As Sharon mentioned, I'm going to talk about using the MMPI-2-RF in forensic psychological evaluations. Obviously, this is a bit of a brief overview since we only have about 1 hour together. I'm going to start out with giving you a brief overview of the MMPI-2-RF, but I assume that you guys already have some familiarity with the instrument. Then we're going to spend the bulk of the time on various forensic applications of the test and also talk a bit about admissibility issues and especially addressing challenges that might be levied against MMPI-2-RF-based testimony. And we're going to end with a case example where the MMPI-2-RF was used in a forensic psychological evaluation. So starting out with the MMPI-2-RF, I'm sure you guys are already aware. It was published in 2008 by Yossi Ben-Porath and Alke Tellegen, serving as co-authors on the instrument. The test has 338 true-false items, and all of these items come from the original MMPI-2 item pool. And by using the same items, that allowed us to continue to use the MMPI-2 normative sample with some minor adjustments. The MMPI-2-RF uses the non-gender based normative sample, where a small proportion of women were randomly excluded to ensure that the gender balance was perfect. So the MMPI-2-RF has 51 scales. 9 of these scales are so-called validity scales that are meant to assess various forms of response bias, like inconsistent responding, indiscriminate, fixed responding, over-reporting, and under-reporting. The remaining 42 MMPI-2-RF scales measure substantive clinical content, and they're organized in a hierarchical fashion. So we have the higher order scales on top of the interpretive hierarchy. These measure broad-based, pervasive forms of psychopathology in the domains of internalizing, externalizing, and thought dysfunction. At the mid-tier of the hierarchy, and kind of at the core of the MMPI-2-RF, we have the 9 restructured clinical scales, and then at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have the 23 specific problem scales that get at more narrow-based symptoms and traits. These 23 specific problem scales are organized into 4 thematic domains of somatic cognitive, internalizing, externalizing, and interpersonal scales. So that's essentially the hierarchy. The high order scales on top, then the RCE scales, and then the specific problem scales. In parallel to this hierarchy, we also have 2 interest scales and 5 personality psychopathology 5 scales. The latter are viewed as dimensional measures of personality pathology and map directly onto the personality trait domains in the DSM-5's alternative personality disorder model. In terms of guiding the use of the MMPI-2-RF, there are 3 standard manuals. The Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation, which is the blue one to the left. The Technical Manual, which includes a lot of the psychometric information on the instrument, is the green one in the back, and then the User's Guide for the reports that details the use of the score report and interpretive report is the yellow one in front. For those of you who want to know more about the general use of the MMPI-2-RF, the evolution of the MMPI instrument into the RF, the development of the various scales and underlying constructs for MMPI-2-RF scales, interpretive guidelines, and various case studies, I recommend that you consider Yossi Ben-Porath's book, Interpreting the MMPI-2-RF. There are a couple of important differences between the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-2-RF that I want to briefly cover, and this is mostly for those of you who are familiar with the MMPI-2 and may have used MMPI-2 in forensic evaluations. The first important difference to keep in mind are the validity scales. Even though they are, at the surface, revised levels of their MMPI-2 counterparts, at least some of them. There are some important differences to note. The first one is the elimination of item overlap. So unlike for the MMPI-2, there's very little item overlap among these validity scales. The only source of overlap is that FBSR that we'll talk about in a minute, I think has a couple of items that overlap with other scales. And the FR scale, which is the infrequent responses scale, and the scale that is a revised version of its MMPI-2 counterpart, is rather substantially revised because it's consisting of infrequent items in the MMPI-2 normative sample, and more specifically, items that are endorsed 10% or less of the time in both men and women. And this is a rather significant revision from the MMPI-2-F scale, because that scale essentially retained many of the items that were on the original MMPI-F scale, and many of those items are deemed no longer infrequent in the MMPI-2 normative sample. So this is a rather substantial revision. The FS scale is new to the MMPI-2-RF. It's infrequent somatic responses, and this is a scale that essentially look at items that are infrequent in medical populations and also normative populations, and all of them are somatic content. So individuals who are high in the scale are essentially reporting a variety of unusual somatic complaints that most medical patients would not report, and extremely high scores are associated with over-reporting. The FBSR this used to be called a fake bad scale on MMPI-2. It's renamed to symptom validity scale because that is obviously a bit less pejorative. And the FBSR is essentially a revised version. It's 30 of the 43 items that had remained on MMPI-2-RF. The RBS is the response bias scale, also new to the MMPI-2-RF, was developed by Roger Gervais and colleagues. This scale consists of items that differentiated individuals who failed so-called performance validity tests and forensic disability evaluations from those individuals who passed such tests. And it's essentially a measure of exaggerated memory complaints. There's now been a ton of studies on the validity scales, over 75 studies alone that have focused on one or more of the validity scales on MMPI-2-RF. And there are even 2 meta-analyses published now on the over-reporting scales showing great utility. So they're very well supported. The second important difference between MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF that I want to mention briefly is that the MMPI-2-RF scale scores focus on psychological constructs rather than psychiatric syndromes. Some of you may recall the basic clinical scales on MMPI and MMPI-2 were meant to target psychiatric syndromes like schizophrenia, depression, hysteria, and so forth. Whereas for the MMPI-2-RF, they wanted to abandon that focus of one scale to one syndrome approach and focus on a more psychometrically sound targeting of transdiagnostic psychological constructs that are all discussed in detail in Joseph and Porras' book. Now, these constructs are linked to contemporary models of personality and psychopathology. I mentioned Psi-5 earlier, for instance. Those 5 trait domains directly map onto those in the DSM-5 alternative model of personality disorders. We've been done a ton of structural work with the MMPI-2-RF, showing that the measure as a whole really map onto contemporary developments like the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology and so forth that's really taking on in the field. Despite this focus on psychological constructs, the MMPI-2-RF scales can inform diagnostic assessments. The manual, for instance, lists various diagnostic considerations for most of the substantive scales. And also, they're not tied to any particular diagnosis. So if you take a scale like RC2, low positive emotions, which essentially measures anhedonia. Well, anhedonia is relevant to a wide range of psychopathology. It's a core symptom of depression, but also of social anxiety disorder, avoidant personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and so forth. So the idea that just one particular construct maps onto one particular diagnosis is simply not supported. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about forensic applications of the MMPI-2-RF. And the MMPI-2-RF can be used and is being used in a variety of contexts where psychologists have been asked to address psycholegal questions, like in criminal court settings, for instance, looking at competence in trial or evaluating people's mental state at the time of the offense to see if they qualify for an insanity defense, risk assessments, but also in civil litigation. We look at things like personal injury evaluations. Some people file disability claims, such as workers' compensation in North America, family court evaluations, especially child custody and parental fitness, but also correctional settings. So we're going to talk about these in some more detail. So starting out, though, with some general considerations that pertain to all types of forensic evaluations. There are two areas in which the MMPI-2-RF is quite important and can yield very useful information. The first part is the assessment of response spikes. In forensic psychological evaluations, individuals tend to have a greater external incentive to distort their responses to the MMPI-2-RF, but also presenting themselves more generally in a distorted manner in the context of the evaluation. Individuals who go through an insanity evaluation, for instance, certainly might have an external incentive to be acquitted from their charges and placed in a hospital rather than going to prison. But it's important to keep context into mind when doing these types of evaluations, because some types of evaluations will, of course, pull for over-reporting or even malingering, such as the example I just gave you. But other psycholegal questions might pull more for under-reporting, like in a risk assessment, for instance, an individual might want to be released from a hospital or be placed on parole. And those individuals, of course, would have an incentive to under-report potential problems. Similarly, in family court evaluations, you tend to see a great deal of under-reporting. So the context, of course, matters and needs to be considered when interpreting scores on the MMPI-2-RF, especially the validity scales. The second broad consideration for using the MMPI-2-RF across these evaluations is the assessment of psychopathology symptoms. After all, that's why we would use this measure. And for many psycholegal questions, we oftentimes are asked to determine or need to determine if a person is suffering from a severe mental illness. So we're talking about symptoms of psychosis and mania, for instance, that can essentially generate some poor reality testing in individual to a degree where they cannot rationally reason with their lawyers, for instance, in a competency evaluation, or might have a significant psychotic disorder that render them mentally impaired at the time of the offense. Regardless, the MMPI-2-RF, of course, measure these types of constructs. There are 4 scales that target psychotic type symptoms on the MMPI-2-RF. All of them belong to the thought dysfunction domain. In the assessment of mania, extremely high scores on RC9 and activation, for instance, get at those types of symptoms. But also more broadly, depending on the type of evaluation, the assessment of mood disorder or emotional dysregulation can be done with the internalizing scales. In many contexts, the presence of personality disorder or other types of behavioral dysfunctions acting out is very important. In the Psi-5 scales and other externalizing scales, for instance, can get at these types of problems. So, but let's talk a little bit about specific types of psycholegal questions. So in criminal court evaluations, psychologists may be asked to determine if an individual is competent to stand trial, or at least inform the court about issues that pertain to competence to stand trial. And usually, at least in the United States, We talk about the Dusky versus United States criteria, which look at whether or not the person can understand the nature and objectives of court proceedings, including the various roles of individuals. Can the person also assist rationally in preparing a defense for him or herself with their lawyer? And that's, of course, a capacity-focused test. Is the person able to do these things? Doesn't matter if they're unwilling or uncooperative. That doesn't render someone incompetent, but rather is the individual capable of understanding the nature and objectives of proceedings and assisting their attorney in preparing the defense. This means it's focused on current function. How's the person doing right now? And competency to stand trial can be raised at any point in the trial proceeding. So it's very much currently focused, and that's also what the MMPI-2-RF does best. The MMPI-2-RF will give you an idea of how the person is currently doing, much more so than how they've done in the past, which is quite important. And as I just mentioned, it measures a variety of symptoms that might render someone incompetent, like being overtly psychotic or in a manic episode or something like that. Of course, it does not measure cognitive deficits that might render someone incompetent, like intellectual disability or dementia and so forth. Obviously, in a neuropsychologically focused evaluation be necessary to address those types of points. In terms of criminal responsibility, which usually focus on insanity defense, we're looking to determine the person's mental state at the time of the offense. And of course, here one has to be very careful about the different sanity standards. Different states in the U.S. usually have different wordings for their sanity standards. The different countries have different wordings. Although it is quite interesting, I worked in 4 different countries that are inspired by, all British common law, and the sanity defenses tend to be very much oriented and offsprings of the old McNaughton rule. So whether or not the person was mentally impaired at the time of the offense, and if that affected the person's ability to differentiate right from wrong. But it's important, of course, to know the exact nature of the standard in the jurisdiction in which you practice. Now, mental state at the time of the offense evaluation, of course, is a retrospective evaluation, which is far more challenging, especially with respect to using psychometric instruments like the MMPI-2-RF that measures current functioning. And in fact, some people have questioned what is really the utility of using the MMPI-2-RF in these types of evaluation, given that the RF certainly will not give you information specifically about how the person is doing at the time of the offense, especially if the evaluation is taking place several months, if not years, after the offense was initially committed. So, but I argue it's still quite useful for 2 reasons. Again, the assessment of response bias, which of course dictates how the person is currently approaching the evaluation. That is quite important. The validity scales can determine whether or not someone is over-reporting, for instance. But also, many of the things that would render someone insane and meet the very high threshold for insanity, these are not transient constructs. They tend to be chronic forms of psychopathology, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and so forth. So the MMPI-2-RF can certainly give some useful information. For instance, if an individual is claiming insanity and take the MMPI-2-RF and no scale set would indicate that a person is psychotic or manic or have any other proclivities that would qualify them for mental impairment, then that is useful information. Unless perhaps they have multiple records showing past history of these disorders and they're currently being treated. On the other hand, if the person is showing lots of scale elevation suggesting current psychoses or mania, the person has not been undergoing treatment, and there's some support that the person might have been like this in the past as well. This is useful information. It does not explicitly tell you that the person was like this at the time of the offense, but it is still evidence, in my opinion, that could potentially support such an opinion. In terms of risk assessment, we're typically looking at the assessment of dangerousness in the future, and most risk assessment evaluations focus on the assessment of both static and dynamic risk factors. Static are the historical, unchangeable risk factors, whereas the dynamic risk factors are those that are amenable to change and intervention and rehabilitation. The MMPI-2-RF does do a better job of getting at the dynamic risk factors than the static risk factors, again, given that its emphasis on current functioning rather than past functioning. But it is important to keep in mind that several MMPI-2-RF scales do directly assess past externalizing history. All of the items on the juvenile conduct problem scale, for instance, are awarded in the past tense. Several items on the substance abuse scales are awarded in the past tense. But the types of dynamic risk factors that the MMPI-2-RF could be quite good at getting at, and this is an abbreviated list, are things like emotional dysregulation, behavioral instability, like impulsivity, active symptoms of mental illness, personality disorder traits, which I don't list here, and poor insight. There's no insight scale on MMPI-2-RF, but we know from past research on the L scale and previous versions of the L scale that it is implicated in having poor insight, especially if there is no other reason to suspect the person is underreporting. In terms of civil litigation and disability evaluations, we're of course looking at determining current functioning. How's the person currently doing? It's very important to consider assessment of response bias, as it is for all evaluations. But here in particular, the MMPI-2-RF somatic and cognitive overreporting scales seems to be particularly relevant based on research. These scales, the FS, FBSR, and RBS, seems to be particularly useful in these contexts in detecting individuals who are overreporting physical and cognitive symptoms, for instance. Now, when we're doing this type of evaluation, one of the key questions that we're oftentimes asked to address is whether or not the plaintiff or claimant in these proceedings was actually harmed. And the type of harm that we as psychologists tend to be concerned about are things like depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and chronic pain. These seem to be the most common ones that are reported in surveys. The MMPI-2-RF, of course, have scales that get at these symptoms underlying these broader diagnostic categories. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but I'm just listing some of the key scales associated with these types of issues. I want to point out in particular that the anxiety scale here is the best predictor of post-traumatic stress symptoms on the entire test. It's of course not diagnostic of PTSD. It's relevant to other forms of emotional dysregulation as well. But in the context of PTSD, it does do the best at predicting such symptoms. Now, another thing that we're oftentimes asked to evaluate is whether or not the person is disabled or impaired due to the current psychiatric diagnosis. While higher scores on MMPI-2-RF scales do indicate greater severity, it is hard to use the MMPI-2-RF alone to make this type of basis, and of course we need to look at the totality of the person's current circumstances to address that question. Another thing that's often asked in these types of evaluations is, did event X at time Y cause or contribute to the current diagnosis, especially in personal injury or disability considerations? That is the key issue. Or is this already a pre-existing condition? The MMPI-2-RF, of course, cannot answer that at all, can only tell you whether or not their symptoms are currently present. But with respect to the causal factors of these symptoms, we really need to look at external sources. Excuse me. In terms of family court considerations, here psychologists are oftentimes asked to address the psychological best interests of the child, and doing so by evaluating the parents. And there are just a few things that I want to highlight with respect to doing these types of evaluations. First of all, there tends to be a very high degree of underreporting in these types of evaluations. And here the use of comparison groups that are available both for child custody and in the parental fitness evaluations can be quite useful and help you determine whether or not the level of underreporting, for instance, that you're seeing in this individual is typical in these contexts or atypical. Perhaps the L and K scales that are measuring underreporting are elevated, but the comparison groups might suggest that this is quite common, these level of elevations for individuals who undergo these evaluations, whereas if they're substantially above what's typically common, underreporting conclusions can be drawn with more confidence. Now, of course, current functioning could potentially interfere with parenting, and that's what the MMPI-2-RF measures the best in terms of psychopathology and maladaptive personality traits. Of course, psychopathology or maladaptive personality traits does not disqualify anyone from being a parent. There are other circumstances that need to be considered and evaluated extant to the MMPI-2-RF, but the RF does pick up on these types of things that could be useful in formulating an opinion. But it's very important to keep in mind that the MMPI-2-RF is not a measure of parental ability. It's not a predictor of future parenting. There's been no studies to suggest this, so it needs to be used for what it is, which is the assessment of psychopathology and maladaptive personality traits. And then finally, just want to talk briefly about correctional settings. Psychologists who work in such settings are oftentimes asked to address whether an offender might have certain mental health needs and therefore require some particular form of intervention. And of course, this is why the MMPI was originally developed. It provides information about psychopathology quite well. But also sometimes you're asked to provide information about that pertains to security classification and risk assessments. Should this offender, for instance, be sent to a higher security institution? And here the principles of risk assessment come into play, which we talked about earlier. The MMPI-2-RF does well at prediction of self-harm, which is quite important in correctional settings and forensic psychiatric institutions. In fact, David Glassmeyer and colleagues published a really good study using a Patton State Hospital sample where they show that the MMPI-2-RF suicide death ideation scale predicted who would engage in suicide attempts 12 months later after the test had been administered. And it actually out-predicted interview-based current suicidal ideation as well as a history of past suicidal attempts. So this scale can be quite useful in this regard. And then sometimes we're asked to make an opinion about parole release. And again, the types of risk factors I talked about earlier would apply here. So this, of course, covered these types of evaluations quite quickly, and I could have gone into a lot more detail, of course, but in the context of a 1-hour webinar, there's only so much I can do. For those of you who found this useful, I do want to put in a somewhat shameless plug here for my book that I co-authored with Dustin Wygant on the forensic applications of the MMPI-2-RF, the case book, where we talk about many of the things we just discussed, except it goes into far more detail, including the assessment of response bias. There's a whole chapter dedicated to that topic. And then there's the one chapter for using the MMPI-2-RF in 8 of the most common types of criminal and civil forensic evaluations, including family court evaluations. And we provide a case example for using the MMPI-2-RF in each of these. Okay, so now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about addressing challenges to MMPI-2-RF-based testimony. The types of things I'm going to talk about in this section, of course, pertain to general use of the MMPI-2-RF. That is, if someone were to question, should the MMPI-2-RF even be used in a psychological evaluation or a particular form of forensic psychological evaluation, I think some of this information can be quite useful in addressing those types of challenges. Of course, any individual interpretation based on MMPI-2-RF could be subject to challenge and could be subject to successful challenge. So it always behooves psychologists to make sure that the interpretations that are done based on MMPI-2-RF scales are consistent with empirical literature as well as interpretive guidelines for the test. Anything that is inconsistent with the literature or outside of recommended guidelines, of course, could be subject to a successful challenge. I can't, of course, talk about every single individual issue that could be challenged. So again, as I mentioned, it will be focused on more general purposes of use. And for this purpose, I'm going to focus on the factors that arose in a U.S. Supreme Court case, Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. I believe that was in 1992 or 3 or something like that. In this test, they challenged the use of the old Fry test that was a Supreme Court decision rendered in the 1920s that essentially suggested that only techniques should be used by experts that are generally accepted by the scientific and professional community. And that was viewed as too stringent in the Daubert case because there are new techniques that could be used that would have sufficient reliability or validity, but because they're new, they might not yet have garnered general acceptance. So the Daubert case did generate some broader criteria for trial judges to consider when determining whether or not information should be admissible. And it's quite interesting. I have worked in Australia, I worked in New Zealand now, and trial judges do tend to consider these, even though they may not necessarily rely specifically on the U.S. Supreme Court cases, although they do to some degree, even on this side of the world. They do tend to focus on similar types of factors, which is useful. And even in the U.S., where some states still adhere to the old Fry standard, trial judges oftentimes do consider things like reliability and validity beyond general acceptance. And anyhow, so these are the 5 factors that we're going to talk about here with respect to the MMPI-2-RF. Has the technique been tested? Has it been subject to peer review? What's the technique's known or potential rate of error? Are there standards controlling the technique's operation? Is the technique generally accepted, retaining that old Fry standard? So I'm going to go over this pretty quickly because I do think that the MMPI-2-RF meet all of these factors. So this will just give you some ammunition. Has the technique been tested? Well, here we can address it by considering whether or not there's empirical data available in the technique. And of course, when the test even was released in 2008, there was the MMPI-2-RF technical manual. And the MMPI-2-RF technical manual includes a wide range of psychometric information, including 136 tables of external correlates that essentially address validity of MMPI-2-RF scale scores. And these empirical correlates have been derived from a range of settings, including mental health, medical settings, substance abuse treatment settings, 2 types of forensic settings, and so forth. Across these samples, the total well over 6,000 individuals. There are 605 independent external criteria on which the MMPI-2-RF scales were evaluated. Some were clinician ratings, therapist ratings, history data, other self-report questionnaires, and so forth. And all in all, it totals almost 54,000 correlations. And there's also descriptive data from a wide range of settings. It's a very abbreviated list here. but the descriptive data that make up the various comparison groups for the MMPI-2-RF are published in the technical manual and allows the psychologist using the test to essentially compare findings to these types of settings and contexts. The second criteria is, has the MMPI-2-RF been subjected to peer review? While there are over 400 peer-reviewed publications that have included MMPI-2-RF scales for a wide range of settings, here I'm just listing some citations looking at different things that are relevant in forensic and correctional settings. This is very much an abbreviated list, but you can look at correctional settings, risk assessment, psychopathy, malingering. These are some areas that have been addressed in great detail, but also, of course, just using the test more generally. What are the external correlates in these types of forensic correctional settings have been published as well. What is the known or potential rate of error for the MMPI-2-RF? Well, data on reliability and more specifically standard error measurement of MMPI-2-RF scale scores do address these questions directly. And in the technical manual, for instance, we see lots of reliability information, including retest estimates of reliability, internal consistency, Chromebox alpha in particular, across a wide range of different settings, including normative sample and various mental health settings. And this allows us to calculate standard error measurement, which is the average expected rate of error associated with an MMPI-2-RF scale score, and they're expressed in T-score units. And as you can see in this table, these tend to be fairly small and pretty consistent with what you see for other good personality inventories. But also classification accuracy statistics can be used to determine the rate of error in making decisions. The validity scales have been most subject to this type of analysis, where we look at sensitivity, specificity, predictive powers, and hit rates in determining our accuracy in making things like over-reporting versus not over-reporting types of classifications. This is just one example study that we published quite a while ago now, where we used the MMPI-2-RF over-reporting scales to differentiate individuals that have been deemed malingering or over-reporting on the SARS, the structured interview for reported symptoms, and those who have been deemed to be genuine responders. And we calculated sensitivity and specificity and predictive powers across a range of different cut scores on the FR scale and FPR scale, because these are the ones that, of course, assess for over-reporting of psychopathology. I'm not going to go over these numbers or anything, because predictive powers are dependent on base rates. We looked at these across a range of hypothetical base rates. And you see two numbers here, actually, because we had two comparison groups, one that was just genuine responders and one that included those who were intermediate range, or I'm sorry, indeterminate range. Were there standards controlling the MMPI-2-RF? Well, here we can look at the Manual of Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation, and special chapter on procedures for administration and scoring to address that type of question. And then the final factor from the Daubert standard is the MMPI-2-RF generally accepted. Here we can look at the Frye test, for instance, we're looking at whether or not it's being used. Well, it's being used quite increasingly in a wide range of settings. In some settings, it's the personality inventory of choice now, well over the MMPI-2, such as in public safety personnel screening and forensic and neuropsychological evaluations and so forth. And like I mentioned before, in many states, case law guides judges to consider Daubert-like factors, even if they're focused primarily on the Frye test. But nevertheless, so some might be challenged on what are some, is the MMPI-2-RF truly accepted by the general scientific and professional community? I think the answer to that now is a resounding yes. But if you were to ever be challenged on that point, here are some ammunition to combat such challenges. The MMPI-2-RF interpreted guidelines are provided in 2 leading MMPI textbooks by Jack Graham and Roger Green. It's covered in current forensic textbooks, such as Bob Archer and Beth Wheeler's Forensic Use of Clinical Assessment Instruments. It's been translated into multiple languages. It's listed among recommended outcome measures in traumatic brain injury research compiled by the Interagency Traumatic Brain Injury Outcome Measures Workgroup, convened by the National Institutes of Health. It's listed among standard measures used in the assessment of the psychological effects of pain. It's listed among measures and proposed practice guidelines for the assessment of child sexual abusers. It's listed as a recommended measure in a guide to establish a practice on police pre-employment psychological evaluations. It's been highlighted in the Institute of Medicine's report to the U.S. Congress, Psychological Testing in the Service of Disability Determination, where they talk especially about scales that are used to detect over-reporting. It's been discussed favorably in a growing number of books and book chapters, as well as cited in a growing number of federal and state appellate court decisions. And to my knowledge, there has been no case where the MMPI-2-RF was deemed inadmissible for any reason. But it's important to keep in mind again that this type of this type of information I'm giving to you is for general purposes of use. Should the MMPI-2-RF be used in a forensic psychological evaluation? Again, as I mentioned, any individual interpretation could theoretically be subject to a challenge, and if it's not consistent with the literature, then that challenge might actually be upheld. Okay, so I'm going to end this webinar with a case example in which the MMPI-2-RF was used in a forensic psychological evaluation, and particularly in a criminal responsibility evaluation. This evaluation was based in Australia when I used to live there, and the particular standard based on the territory in which I lived. There are states and territories in Australia. The Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra, the capital of Australia, is located. Their standard for criminal responsibility is placed here on the slide. A person is not criminally responsible for an offense if, when carrying out the conduct that were required for the offense, the person was suffering from a mental impairment. That had the effect that A, the person did not know the nature and quality of the conduct, or B, the person did not know that the conduct was wrong, or C, the person could not control the conduct. So essentially here we have elements of multiple different types of insanity standards. It's of course very heavily influenced by McNaughton rule, but we also see some other influences here, including the irresistible impulse test that arose in the United States. So I would say, based on all jurisdictions I've ever practiced, this is one of the more lenient insanity standards, because usually not all these 3 prongs can be considered. The person doesn't know that the conduct is wrong if the person cannot reason with a moderate degree of sense and composure about whether the conduct as seen by a reasonable person is wrong. And that's supposed to provide some guideline, though I'm not sure it is as unambiguous as the lawmakers implied. All right, so in this case, this was a mental state at the time of the offense evaluation in which the MMPI-2-RF was used. And I picked this case now to illustrate how I think the test can actually be useful in this type of evaluation. So this was a 33-year-old Caucasian woman. She had been charged with common assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. And she was evaluated 4 months after this alleged offense had occurred. And essentially what had happened is she had been interviewed for a job at a gentleman's club as a dancer, and witnesses observed her after she exited the interview room break a glass bottle, on the bar and try to stab the bar or club owner with it. And there were several witnesses to this, and she was charged with this crime. She had, and she was evaluated for criminal responsibility. She had a lengthy history of behavioral, mental health, and substance abuse difficulties. She reported, and there was plenty of documentation, that she had been severely sexually abused as a child growing up. She had a history of behavioral problems as a child. She had been expelled from school twice due to violent behavior against other students. Her adjustment appeared to become worse when she turned 17 because her mother died from illness. Her history suggested numerous psychiatric hospitalizations, including mania as an adult. When looking at the plethora of medical records, suggested multiple diagnoses, different diagnoses at different times, including bipolar disorder, various personality disorders, including borderline personality disorder, and various substance use disorders. And also what was quite consistent was her quite inconsistent compliance with treatment in the community. So, as I mentioned, at the time of the offense, she had sought employment at this gentleman's club as a dancer. Others observed her assault the owner of the club with a broken beer bottle. Witnesses also overheard him asking her to leave as she would not be getting the job. After she had assaulted him, she made no attempt to leave the scene, and she waited for the police to arrive. She told the police that the owner had, during the private part of the interview in his office, asked her to suck his something, and to which she said, "I'd rather suck on a fish." She said this to the police. And that he tried to force her go down on him when she refused to do this, which very much upset her, and this led to the assault. Upon jail admission, she was described as quite manic, disorganized, and demanding. It's quotes from the booking records. 16 days earlier, that is prior to the offense, or alleged offense, she had been hospitalized for mania, and she had not continued to take her medication. I interviewed her ex-boyfriend as part of this evaluation, and he reported that she was obsessed with being a vigilante and rescue women from sexual predators. She was quite manic. She had at one point bought a crossbow that she was going to use as a weapon, and shot this crossbow in the floor multiple times. She was living in an upstairs apartment. When the neighbors, who were disturbed by the noise, came and knocked on the door, she threatened them with a crossbow, which led to some problems. She had also subsequently broken up with his boyfriend, and he described that she had created some page on social media with a tombstone with his name on it, and he was a bit frightened by her because of her extremely erratic and unpredictable behavior, but he nevertheless provided a good account and a fairly supportive account of her, because he was arguing that he believed that she must be mentally ill. He reported that after she had been hospitalized, she did not continue to take her medication and rapidly decompensating. She would be online searching for sexual predators for hours, wouldn't be sleeping, and had essentially been convinced that she was meant to be this type of person who was going to hunt these sexual offenders down. She reported to me in the interview, I was losing control. I thought I could be an angel. I'd been reading about the Punisher. He was a comic book vigilante. I wanted to be that. I guess I wasn't right. At the time of the evaluation, she was appeared at least quite manic and disorganized. I even considered not giving her the MMPI-2-RF. I normally don't when a person is uncontrollable or quite disorganized, but she was able to put it together well enough where I decided to give it a shot. So here are the validity scales for the MMPI-2-RF, which of course in a criminal responsibility evaluation we need to determine whether or not the person is potentially over-reporting. Of course, in the context of suspected mania, which it was here, we might want to even look at or begin with, as we always should in interpreting the MMPI-2-RF, by looking at inconsistent responding or indiscriminate fixed or false responding. And interestingly, she provided a consistent protocol. She was able to address the content of the scale, even though at one point when there's an item on the MMPI-2-RF that, I'm paraphrasing now, but suggests something like men, if given the opportunity, takes advantage of women sexually, to which she had a major outburst in her little cubicle where she was completing the MMPI-2-RF and started screaming, and it went on for a 5-minute rant about how this was most definitely true. But she could be calmed down and was able to complete the test. With respect to over-reporting, here are the over-reporting scales. None of these were elevated to any degree that would concern us. The FPR was slightly higher than what you typically see in this context. I'm using the forensic pre-trial criminal group here, but it's still nowhere near where research suggests that we need to be seriously concerned about over-reporting, and therefore this was likely more reflective of psychopathology than actual over-reporting. And there was no evidence of under-reporting in this profile either. So this led me to conclude that this profile was valid for interpretation. So now we start with the various substantive scales on MMPI-2-RF, and to use the interpretive framework that Josip Benporath and the manual recommends, we should always start looking at the higher order scales and look at which is the most highest or most elevated high order scale, and that dictates what domain of functioning that we start interpreting. In this case, it's the BXD scale, the Behavioral Externalizing Functioning Scale. And various scales that belong to this domain, RC4 and RC9. And in particular here, you see RC9 is quite high. In fact, it is one raw score point from being maxed out. And RC9 is a complicated scale in the sense that it very much measures potential manic symptomatology, but also the personality domain of antagonism. So one always needs to have some form of external information interpreting the scale. And it's really extreme scores on the scale that would be especially reflective of manic symptomatology. And in this particular case, of course, given her history, her presentation in the interview, which was suspect of potential manic symptoms, and also, of course, reports from her boyfriend, and including that she had not been taking any medication or been treated since the evaluation, this would suggest the potential presence of a manic episode. But of course, we never just interpret tests in isolation, but this would potentially be supportive of that. And any personality interpretations based on these types of scales, if the person indeed is in a manic episode, should be cautioned, mostly because we don't know if some of these items are being endorsed due to mania, whereas they're being endorsed due to personality dysfunction. One would really have to look at the MMPI-2-RF scores when the person was stable. RC4 was also elevated, T-score of 71, which is consistent with their history and general impulsivity and behavioral dysregulation, irresponsibility, and so forth. And we also want to look at the various external item-specific problem scales because we're interpreting that behavioral domain. And we see that substance abuse is elevated, though based on records, her account, her ex-boyfriend's account, she was not using substances at the time of the offense. She had not been using substances for quite some time. That was a thing of her past many years earlier. It's also important to keep in mind that many of these items on the substance abuse scale are worded in past tense. I'm not going to show the items here because I'm not allowed to for copyright reasons, but when you do inspect the substance abuse items, you do see very much that they were past tense worded items. Aggression and activation are both elevated. These are facets of RC9, and especially activation is maxed out, T-score of 83. This is very important because the activation scale is the best scale on the entire test at differentiating bipolar disorder and mania from other types of psychopathology. And it's more specific to classic manic symptoms like racing thoughts, excessive euphoria, and so on, than is RC9, which is broader. And the aggression, of course, one needs to determine whether or not this is part of the manic psychopathology versus some form of personality dysfunction or other behavioral dysfunction. If the person indeed is deemed to be manic, then that needs to be interpreted in that light for now. And similarly with the Psy-5 scales, you see a maxed out aggressiveness scale in disconstraint, which is extremely behaviorally dysregulated. And if I looked at this profile in isolation, this could might well be someone who's highly psychopathic or antisocial, which is why, again, we don't interpret profiles in isolation. And the types of items on these types of scales could be reflective of the behavioral dysregulation, extreme aggression, irritability, and grandiosity that is also observed in a manic episode. So it's important to keep in mind that even though these are meant to reflect dispositional proclivities, they're not immune to the effects of current mood states and need to be interpreted accordingly. Some other scales are elevated, while THD is elevated, as thought dysfunction, so that domain is interpreted next, and the particular scale that is elevated in that domain is RC6, which is consistent with her paranoid ideation and quite an obsession of a delusional quality that was consistent with her mood disorder, she was a vigilante, that there was all these sexual predators out there and that they needed to be punished. But beyond that, we also see an elevation on RC3, cynicism. She was quite cynical and highly suspicious of other people and their motivations more generally, thinking that all people are bad in the world and will only victimize and hurt other people when given the opportunity to do so. Stress, worry, and anger proneness also elevates, suggesting some level of emotional dysregulation. Could be part of a personality disorder, could also be part of her current manic episode, and that's difficult to determine. Family problems was also elevated in this profile, which is not surprising given some of her history, and also problems with current or past romantic relationships. And negative emotionality, neuroticism, which goes along with a general tendency towards emotional dysregulation. So I sped up there a little bit because I realize I'm out of time. I just want to quickly note again the insanity standard. Was the person suffering from mental impairment? In this case, the answer is yes. It was deemed that she didn't meet diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder. The current episode was indeed manic. The MMPI-2-RF results supported it, and also all of the totality of the information suggested that she was manic at the time of the offense as well, given all of the jail records, mental health records, hospitalization leading up, and the ex-boyfriend's account. But the question is whether or not she met criteria for any of these three, and I'll get right to the point. It was deemed, although I wouldn't say this is black and white, but I deemed that she was so, because of her mental impairment, she could not control her conduct at the time of the offense and attacked this individual. She made no attempt to flee the scene. She realized that she was wrong, so that she didn't meet B, and she understood what she was doing, but and she just could not behaviorally control herself, given her mania, given her delusional thought content about being a vigilante and so forth. All right. So I know I've run out of time. I apologize for that, but I'm still willing to stay on and take any questions for those of you who have time to stay on and listen to my answers.
Hello, Dr. Sellbom. This is Deb. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. We do have a few questions for you, so thanks for being willing to stay over time. The first question relates to any data or studies that there might be to support the forensic use of the MMPI-2-RF with various cultural or racial groups, such as African Americans.
Yeah, there's certainly been some research with the RC scales looking at whether or not there's any test bias across ethnic groups in the United States, and that research has suggested that test bias is rather minimal. There's actually a study that I'm a co-author on that's about to get published. I think it comes from Anthony Taraskovich's group, where they looked at the individuals, Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic descent from a forensic psychiatric setting, where we're shown that there's no test bias, and at least up to a meaningful degree. And if there is any test bias, it's quite inconsistent with respect to what group that it would be biased against. But the effect sizes associated with those are quite small. So I think by and large, for now, there's no reason to believe that there's some significant bias in interpreting MMPI-2-RF scores across different ethnic groups.
Okay, another question here about, you talked a little bit about harm to self. Are there any relevant scales for the evaluation of harm to others? Any studies demonstrating predictive validity for potential harm to others?
Yes, most of the externalizing scales would address this. Some of the citations that I provided under the risk assessment part when I was talking about peer-reviewed research in forensic settings looked at predictive validity. And most of the scales from the externalizing domain seem to be working quite well in that regard. Of course, the aggression scale specifically gets at aggressive ideation, which is a major risk factor, and just general proclivity towards engaging in aggressive behavior. The aggressiveness I-5 scale gets more specifically to instrumental aggression. But beyond that, measures of impulsivity and acting out, generally like disconstraint, behavioral externalizing dysfunction, RC4, and so forth, have all been found in multiple studies to predict future aggressive behavior.
So there's a question here about how do you identify mixed over and under reporting?
Can you repeat that question? How do you demonstrate what type of?
How do you identify a mixture of over and under reporting?
A mixture of over and under. Well, you would look at the scales that assess these. They're not mutually exclusive. So if an individual is engaged in over-reporting and under-reporting simultaneously, you would expect the scales relevant to the type of over-reporting, say psychopathology, to be elevated. And if the person is also under-reporting, you would expect scales pertaining to under-reporting to be elevated as well. I think in the types of contexts where you would sometimes see this is sometimes individuals are trying to over-report, suggesting that they're significantly emotionally or physically hurt or injured. So you see maybe some of the somatic cognitive scales in particular being elevated, but also see the L scale elevated, which essentially suggests that, you know, I'm really hurt, but I'm still a really good person. It would be quite hard to see an incredibly high K scale coupled with the F scales, because that would essentially suggest quite different things. We say I'm significantly injured, but I'm highly resilient and have no emotional or other types of problems. That does not quite go together, but you would see more often both L and the over-reporting scales being elevated in context where a person might be trying to put their best foot forward, but at the same time trying to exaggerate particular problems in certain domains.
Okay, just a couple more questions here. One about any concerns that you might have with using the MMPI-2-RF in forensic settings with Spanish-speaking clients?
Well, it comes down to validity, of course, in terms of evaluating scale scores. There is, of course, a Spanish translation for the MMPI-2-RF that can be used, but the degree to which that particular translation has been validated, of course, is more limited. But that said, as I just mentioned, when you have looked at some test bias, we find that when you compare Hispanic and Caucasian individuals, there's really no evidence for test bias. I would say that if the Spanish translation is being used, then of course that needs to come with some caution. Given how well validity generalizes across so many different settings and so many different groups with the MMPI-2-RF, I think it is still appropriate to have the assumption that the scales are valid, but of course you want to have some caution in doing so. It's similar here in New Zealand. We have a large indigenous population, Maori. There's no Maori in the MMPI-2-RF normative sample. There have been, to my knowledge, no Maori in any validity studies on MMPI-2-RF scale scores, but still individuals use the test with Maori, and I think it is generally appropriate because, again, there's been so many different studies on the test that show that across all these different settings and groups, validity generalizes. So there's no reason to think it shouldn't generalize. I think there would need to be some research to prove the opposite. But that said, I think if you're using a test in a setting and in a particular context with a particular group where there hasn't been extensive or any validation, we have to do that with some caution. So that's a general response.
Okay, and then finally, last question is pretty broad. Any advantages that you might cite of using the MMPI-2-RF instead of the MMPI-2 in forensic evaluations?
Sure. I mean, it's shorter. It's better aligned with contemporary personality and psychopathology models. It gets the psychological constructs that are well defined and articulated in the literature rather than these somewhat now ancient psychiatric syndromes. We have a lot of validity data in the forensic settings, including in terms of predictive validity with using the test. I think the test is better psychometrically designed and can therefore be more defensible in court. And the bottom line is, do you really need these 567 items to get the major points, that you need to with these types of instruments? And I think the answer is no. I mean, the MMPI-2-RF is going to tell you what is going on with this individual, and I cannot, and I scored many MMPI-2s and MMPI-2-RFs back when the test was coming out and I was comparing. I would administer the MMPI-2, but I would score both 2 and RF scales, and I would compare. And I cannot remember a single instance where I felt like the MMPI-2 gave me information that the MMPI-2-RF did not. I think the scales are just more efficient and better configured, and therefore we will get to the point in a far more efficient manner. And the validity scales are every bit as good, if not better.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Sellbom, for a very informational session here today, and also for staying over time in order to answer our participant questions. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who attended this afternoon's webinar. We appreciate your interest in the MMPI-2-RF, and if you would be so kind as to offer your feedback about the session as you exit the webinar in the survey, we would appreciate that as well. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.